Corwin stole through Leona Voss's portfolio across the conference room. 12 people watched it happen. Not one of them said a word. The pages scattered like birds startled from a wire ink sketches, fabric swatches, hand-lettered notes in the margins, sliding across the lacquered table and dropping to the floor in slow, humiliating sequence. Leona stood at the head of the room, 24 years old, still holding the cardboard backing that the portfolio had been clipped to. Her hands didn't shake. She made sure of that. Corwin didn't even look at her when he spoke. "This is what you bring me?" He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, the way a man does when he already knows the verdict and just wants to hear himself deliver it. "This is what you've been working on for 3 weeks?" The room was cold. It was always cold in Hargrove and Stahl's upper-floor offices, that particular brand of corporate cold that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the air that powerful men breathe. Leona said quietly, "The brief asked for something rooted, something with texture and history." They'd asked for marketable. Corwin finally looked at her then, and his expression was the kind that men like him had perfected over decades, not angry, just dismissive. The look that says, "You don't belong here. This looks like something from a craft fair. Your grandmother's tablecloth. I don't know where you thought this was going, but it's not going anywhere near our spring collection." Someone at the table coughed. Someone else found something very interesting to look at on their laptop screen. Leona bent down and picked up her pages one by one from the floor. Nobody helped her. She had taken the train from Akron to New York 3 years before that day, with a portfolio under one arm and a duffel bag over the other shoulder, and exactly $412 in her checking account. She had grown up watching her mother work 60-hour weeks at a dry cleaner's on Maple, pressing other people's clothes into sharp, perfect lines while their own house had a leaky kitchen faucet that sang all winter long. Her mother had never complained about that faucet. She just kept the pot underneath it and emptied the pot every morning before she left for work. Leona had learned early that the distance between surviving and something else was almost always invisible from the outside. She had gotten the internship at Hargrove and Stahl on her 3rd application. The first 2 had gone unanswered. The 3rd she had hand-delivered with a note she'd rewritten 11 times, and someone in HR had apparently found that charming enough to make a phone call. She'd come in for one interview, then another, and on the afternoon of the second one, the creative director at the time, a woman named Petra, who wore her gray hair short and her opinions shorter, had held one of Leona's sketches up to the window light and said simply, "You see things differently. We could use that." Petra had left the company 8 months later, a restructuring. Corwin Stahl had come in from the London office to take over the creative department, and the temperature in the building, literal and otherwise, had dropped by at least 10 degrees. Leona had stayed because she needed the work and because she was good at it, and because she had told her mother she was going to make something of herself in this city, and she was not yet ready to go back to Akron and say otherwise. The morning after Corwin scattered her portfolio across the conference room floor, she came back. She came back the morning after that, too. She came in early and she stayed late, and she did the work that nobody else wanted to do, sourcing trimmings, pulling fabric samples from the archive room, cross-referencing trend reports with production timelines. She did it without being asked and without expecting acknowledgement because she had learned, from watching her mother press strangers' clothes into perfect lines, that dignity was not something other people gave you. It was something you kept for yourself, quietly, like a stone in your pocket. The sketch that started everything had been on a Tuesday in November. The archive room on the 4th floor was where Hargrove and Stahl kept the things nobody wanted anymore. Old lookbooks, discontinued samples, pattern blocks from collections that had never made it to market. It smelled like cardboard and cedar, and a faint ghost of whatever perfume someone had sprayed near the open shelving sometime in the early 2000s. Leona went there to pull reference files and stayed longer than she needed to because it was quiet and because the cold in that room was the honest kind. The kind that comes from old buildings in November rather than from men in expensive chairs. That Tuesday she found a box that had been pushed to the back of the lowest shelf, behind a stack of textile binders from 1991. The box had no label. Inside it was a collection of fabric swatches, handwritten in a looping, careful script color names that weren't color names so much as descriptions. Morning in late October, the inside of a chestnut, river mud after rain, and underneath the swatches, wrapped in a piece of muslin cloth, was a sketchbook. Leona sat down on the floor of the archive room and opened it. The sketches inside were unlike anything in the rest of the building. They were loose and confident and deeply strange in the way that things are strange when they have been made by someone who isn't trying to impress anyone. The lines moved. The proportions were deliberate and unusual. In a corner of the first page, in the same looping handwriting, E. Voss, 1974. Leona's grandmother's name had been Estelle. She sat very still for a moment. Her mother had told her once, when Leona was about 11 years old, that Estelle had worked in fashion in New York for several years before coming back to Ohio. She had said it the way people say things they don't entirely understand, with a kind of vague pride and a lack of specifics, the way family history gets compressed by time and distance into a few broad strokes. Leona had filed it away the way children file things away, under interesting but not immediately useful, and had mostly forgotten it. She had not known that Estelle had sketched. She had not known that her grandmother's hands had held a pencil and made these lines, these particular, brilliant, alive lines, in a book that had somehow ended up in a box on the lowest shelf of an archive room in a building in Midtown Manhattan 50 years later. It took her 3 weeks to understand what she was holding. She spent those weeks going through the sketchbook carefully, page by page, the way you read something you know you'll only get to read once. She researched Estelle's name against the company's early records, which she accessed through the HR department on a pretense about sourcing historical press materials. She found a personnel file from 1972 under the company's original name before the first acquisition, E. Voss pattern designer contract. There was no termination notice. There was no departure note. Just the file, and then nothing, and then 50 years of silence in a cedar-smelling room. She called her mother on a Thursday night. "Mama," she said, "did Grandma Estelle ever work for a company called Hargrove?" There was a long pause on the line. "Why are you asking that?" "Because I found her sketchbook." Another pause, and then her mother said, in a voice that was very quiet and very careful, she didn't like to talk about those years. She said they didn't give her what they promised. She came home, and she never talked about it again. Leona held the phone and looked at the sketchbook open on her kitchen table, at a sketch of a jacket with unusual lapels and a handwritten note in the margin, cut on the bias. "It will drape." She was talented, Leona said. She was really, really talented, Mama. "I know," her mother said. "She made all my school clothes until I was 12. Leona didn't sleep much that night. The collection she built over the next 4 months was not a copy of her grandmother's work. It was a conversation with it. She took the sensibility, the movement, the strange proportions, the color thinking that named shades like feelings, and she brought them forward, updated them, made them speak in a contemporary voice while carrying the memory of the original. She worked in the mornings before anyone else arrived, and in the evenings after the office emptied. She worked at her kitchen table on weekends with the sketchbook open beside her own notebook, the two of them in dialogue across half a century. She did not show it to Corwin. She had learned her lesson about that. What she did instead was enter it into the Meridian Prize. The Meridian was not the kind of competition that got covered in the trade press the way the big shows did. It was quieter than that. An annual award run by a foundation that supported emerging designers, judged by a rotating panel of people whose opinions carried weight precisely because they operated outside the commercial machinery. The entry fee was $200, which Leona put on a credit card and paid off over 3 months. She submitted under her own name, listed her title as independent designer, and did not mention Hargrove and Stahl anywhere on the application. The panel had 12 members. 7 of them were women. 1 of them had known Estelle Voss. Leona did not find that out until much later. The morning the results were announced, she was in the archive room again, because she went there sometimes to think. Her phone buzzed with an email from an address she didn't recognize, and she almost didn't open it because she got a lot of emails. She almost didn't open it. She opened it because something in the subject line, Meridian Prize 2026, announcement, made her hands do the thing they hadn't done the day Corwin scattered her pages across the floor. They shook. She read the email 3 times. Then she sat down on the floor of the archive room, in the cedar-smelling dark, and put her face in her hands and cried for approximately 4 minutes. Not sad crying. The other kind. Then she stood up, wiped her face on her sleeve, and went back upstairs to finish pulling the fabric samples she'd been assigned. Corwin found out on a Friday. He found out because someone sent him a link, the Meridian Foundation's announcement page, which had gone up that morning with a photograph of the winning collection and a short piece of text about the designer. Leona Voss, currently based in New York, draws on the forgotten legacy of her grandmother. Pattern designer Estelle Voss, who worked in the New York fashion industry in the early 1970s before returning to Ohio. The collection represents a reclamation and continuation of a design voice that was never given the platform it deserved. Corwin read the announcement in his office with the glass walls, visible to anyone who happened to look up from the open floor. Several people happened to look up. He called Leona into his office at 11 that morning. She came in and stood across from his desk and did not sit down because he did not invite her to sit. "You entered a competition," he said. "Yes. Using materials and influences developed during your time here." Leona looked at him. "I entered work I developed on my own time, drawing on my grandmother's original sketches from 1974. Those sketches predate this company's current ownership by about 20 years. Corwin's jaw moved slightly, the way jaws move when someone is deciding what to say next. "This is a conversation HR will need to be part of." "I agree," Leona said. "I look forward to that conversation." She left his office and went back to her desk and sent 3 emails, one to the foundation, one to a lawyer whose name she'd gotten from a friend of a friend who had once dealt with a non-compete clause at a comparable company, and one to her mother. The HR conversation happened. The legal question about intellectual property was resolved quickly. Leona had been meticulous about documentation, keeping receipts and timestamps for every element of the work, none of which had touched Hargrove and Stahl's systems or resources. There was nothing to claim. What happened next moved faster than Leona expected. The Meridian opened doors in the way that certain kinds of recognition do, not because the prize itself was famous, but because the people who cared about it were exactly the people who opened doors. A buyer from a small but serious boutique in Chicago reached out within a week. A profile ran in a design journal that Leona had been reading since college. A woman named Dawit, who ran a residency program for designers who had come up outside traditional pathways, sent an email that Leona read so many times she could recite it. She gave notice at Hargrove and Stahl on a Tuesday morning, which seemed right because it had been a Tuesday when she found the box. She did not make a speech. She did not leave a note on anyone's desk. She packed the things from her small workspace, which were not many, because she had always known, somewhere quiet and practical in the back of her mind, that she was not going to be there forever. And she took the elevator down and walked out onto the street and stood for a moment in the cold November air. Then she walked to the post office and mailed a copy of the Meridian announcement, printed on plain paper, to her mother's address in Akron. She wrote on the back of the envelope in her own whooping handwriting. The same handwriting she had noticed as her grandmother's. "It turns out she taught me everything. I just didn't know it yet." Corwin Stahl's tenure at Hargrove and Stahl ended the following spring. The circumstances were reported on briefly in the trade press and had nothing to do with Leona, except in the way that organizations sometimes reveal their own dysfunction more clearly once someone who was absorbing the pressure of it is no longer there to absorb it. The spring collection underperformed. There was another restructuring. Leona was in Chicago by then, in a studio the size of her mother's living room, working on a second collection that had the same quality of aliveness that the first one had. That particular quality that comes not from technique alone, but from making something that means something to you, something that carries the weight of the people who made you. The residency Dawit had told her about brought her into contact with 11 other designers, most of them women, most of them under 35, most of them with some version of the same story, the talent that hadn't fit the box, the room where the temperature dropped when you walked in, the moment when someone with power looked at the thing you'd made with your whole self and told you it wasn't good enough. Leona started a mentorship program with 4 of them in the second year. She called it the Estelle Initiative. She did not explain the name publicly because she didn't need to. The people who needed to understand it understood it. The sketchbook was in her studio in a glass-fronted case she'd had made to the right dimensions. She looked at it every day. Sometimes she talked to it, in the way that you talk to people who are no longer here, but who are not, precisely, gone. There is something that happens when a person who has been told that what they carry is worthless discovers that what they carry is exactly what was missing. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive in a single moment of triumph, though the moments of triumph are real. It arrives the way most true things arrive, gradually, in the ordinary rhythm of daily work, in the feel of fabric between your fingers and the movement of a pencil across paper, in a particular quality of light in a studio on a cold morning when you are doing the thing you were made to do and you know it. Estelle Voss had come back to Ohio in 1974 and never talked about those years. She had made school clothes for her daughter out of remnant fabric from the dry goods store on Main Street, and she had kept her sketchbook, and somewhere in the keeping of it, she had trusted that it would matter to someone, someday, even if she never knew who. She knew now. I keep thinking about the box on the lowest shelf, the one with no label, the one nobody had touched in decades. That's where this whole story really lives, for me, not in the conference room where the pages hit the floor, not in the announcement email that made Leona's hands shake for the first time. It lives in that cedar-smelling archive room, in the fact that Estelle Voss kept her sketchbook. She didn't throw it away after she came back to Ohio. She didn't burn it, didn't bury the years she'd spent making something beautiful only to have it go nowhere. She kept it, wrapped in muslin, and somehow it ended up exactly where it needed to be, 50 years later, waiting for the one person in the building who would know what she was looking at. I don't think that's luck. I think that's what happens when a person lives with integrity, when they refuse to let bitterness define what they leave behind. Estelle could have destroyed every trace of those New York years. A lot of people would have. Instead, she preserved the work because some part of her understood that the work itself had value, regardless of whether anyone in power had ever confirmed that for her. That's a kind of moral clarity that most of us spend our whole lives trying to find. And then there's Leona. What she did with that sketchbook wasn't just emotionally meaningful, it was sharp. She didn't copy her grandmother's designs and call it homage. She studied them. She understood what made them work. She figured out how to translate a sensibility from 1974 into something that could speak in 2026 without losing what made it alive in the first place. That kind of intelligence, the ability to look at something old and understand its bones, then build something new without breaking them, that's not taught in any program. It's developed by paying attention over a long time, quietly, without anyone applauding you for it. And she was patient. I think about that a lot. Leona came back to that office every morning after Corwin scattered her pages across the floor. Not because she was a pushover, not because she didn't feel it. She came back because she was playing a longer game, and she knew it, and she was disciplined enough to keep going anyway. She documented everything. She protected herself legally before she needed to. She entered the competition without telling anyone, without making a scene, without needing Corwin to witness her next move. That kind of endurance, the kind that isn't loud, isn't dramatic, just keeps showing up and doing the work. That's what actually changes outcomes. Corwin thought he was throwing away something worthless. What he was actually doing was revealing the limits of his own vision. That's usually how it goes. The people who tell you that what you carry has no value are almost always the people who can't recognize value unless it arrives in a form they already expected. Estelle's sketchbook survived because she had the character to keep it. Leona's collection existed because she had the intelligence to understand it and the persistence to see it through. Those three things together: character, clear thinking, and the willingness to keep going when nobody is watching. I don't know a single story of real, lasting success that doesn't have all three of them in it somewhere. The industry begged for the recipe. They always do, eventually. The question is just whether you'll still have it when they come asking.